And good evening, everybody, and welcome and thank you for joining us this evening for the first ever online live event of the Dutch Zouaves Museum. And the idea to do something online came up while discussing possible events for the 75th anniversary of our museum. And the Papal Zouaves were a mix of different nationalities, and that is why a meeting like this seems a good way for people near and far to learn more about a fascinating subject. This evening, we welcome our guest speaker, author of the book Victorian Crusaders, Nicholas Schofield. Good evening, Nick.
Good evening, Arne.
Good evening. Live from Uxbridge in the UK, all across the channel. Nick, how did you become interested in the Zouaves, this subject, this curious?
Well, I was lucky enough to stay at the English College in Rome as a student for 4 years back in the late 1990s. And in the back of the chapel there is a monument to Julian Watts Russell, one of the first English Zouaves who was killed at the Battle of Mentana. And I passed his monument several times every day and became interested. And then I saw photos of the Zouaves in their rather unusual uniform, and I just became interested and thought, one day somebody should probably write a book about the British people who were part of the Zouave regiment. And it took me about 20 years to actually start that project. And thanks to lockdown, despite all the awful things connected to that period, I had a bit of time to write the book.
Yeah, and now you finished it last year, and it's published, and it's out and about. So, and well, I've read it, of course, and I think it's a very good book. Well, thank you for agreeing to talk to us about Zouaves tonight and this evening. And well, let's go to the presentation you prepared. Let me share that for our viewers. And so also. And
lovely.
Yes. Well, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everyone. Greetings from London. And it's a great honor to give this first online talk for the Dutch Zouave Museum. I remember visiting the museum about 9 or 10 years ago when I was on holiday in the Netherlands. And I really enjoyed seeing the museum and also visiting the beautiful basilica. And then more recently, I got to know Arno when I was writing the book. And it's a great privilege to be talking to you this evening. Apologies that my Dutch is not very good, so I'm giving this talk in English. I hope you can all hear and understand me. I realize that some of you listening to this talk, whether it's live or on YouTube, will be connected to the Dutch Zouave Museum, but there might be other listeners from England and other parts of the world. So for that reason, I'm going to give a bit of general background to the subject first, just for those who don't know much about Zouaves, and then look in a bit more detail at the British Zouaves. So let's go to the second slide. The title of my talk is The Victorians Who Fought for the Pope. And that might seem a rather surprising subject, because when we think of 19th century Britain, Victorian Britain, firstly, we think of it as a very much a Protestant nation, but also as a largely peaceful society, a time of vast social and technological changes, the age of Charles Dickens and Victoria and Albert. Unlike most of Europe, Britain escaped any serious revolution in 1830 or 1848, and any wars that Britain were involved in were fought a long way away, either in the Crimea or in the colonies. And yet we often forget that the 19th century in Britain, as with elsewhere, was a time of great anxiety. Especially there were fears of French invasion by Napoleon III, which led to the building of fortifications that we can still find around the south coast, like the one in the picture in the top right-hand corner. And also the construction of the first ironclad warship, HMS Warrior, which you can see below it, and which you can still visit in Portsmouth. With French defeat in 1870 came increasing concerns about Germany, about the growth of Prussia, and the readiness of Britain to defend itself in the event of an emergency. And there was even a series of short novels about imaginary invasions, like the one you see on the screen, The Battle of Dorking, which is all about a German-speaking enemy landing near Worthing on the south coast around 1871. So 19th century Britain is a very anxious society, and it's also highly militarized. By 1898, 22% of British men had some sort of military experience, either in the standing army or in the various volunteer units that were a precursor to the territorial army, the yeomanry and the militia and the rifle volunteers and so forth. And we see this reflected in church activities. Many 19th century religious groups adopted military uniforms and military structures. We think especially of the Salvation Army. Not sure whether that exists in the Netherlands, but it has quite a big presence in Britain. Or hymns that we sing in church, like Onward Christian Soldiers or Fight the Good Fight. So this is all part of the context behind what we're talking about this evening. The 19th century being a time of anxiety and very much a military society. Let's move to the next slide. Just as in the political sphere, there was a sense of threat and fragility, so the same could be said for the religious sphere. When we think of Roman Catholicism in this period, we think largely about the Catholic revival in Britain, made possible by Irish immigrants and wealthy converts. English Catholics were finally freed from restrictions of laws that dated back to the 16th and 17th centuries. In fact, only in 1791 could Catholic churches and schools be officially opened, and only in 1829 could Catholics take public office. Could Catholics, for example, become members of Parliament? So British Catholics were experiencing a new freedom, and they were also eager to show that they could be loyal citizens. And yet also there was a sense of deep insecurity. To some extent, the 19th century was dominated by the aftermath of the French Revolution. So much so that in church and society, so much was a reaction to the French Revolution, both positive and negative. There was an ongoing culture war between faith and reason, between tradition and innovation, between legitimacy and usurpation. Some have even described 19th century Christianity as experiencing a kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome, which lasted well into the 20th century. After all, throughout this period, clergy were being murdered, dioceses suppressed, religious life made illegal, property seized, 2 popes had been imprisoned, and the papal states decimated. As recently as 1849, as I'm sure you know, the Pope had fled Rome after it was declared a godless republic, and he was only reinstated thanks to French and Austrian military aid. Attempts were made as a result to expand the papal army and to modernize it. The Pope was seen constantly under threat. And by the mid-19th century, there were still many dangers around. Revolutionaries like Giuseppe Mazzini, who dreamed of a united Italy. Napoleon III in France, who tried to combine his double role as, on the one hand, supporter of liberalism, and on the other hand, protector of the church. The northern kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia under Cavour, on the other hand, was happy to take any opportunity to increase its influence over Italy and the church. And then there was the charismatic anti-clerical guerrilla leader Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was ready to give arms to any cause that he believed in. Now, to cut a long story short, and it's a story that many of you know already, thanks to a series of military campaigns, diplomacy, apparently popular votes, and also coincidences and accidents, the Kingdom of Italy was declared in 1861, replacing the previous patchwork of tiny states. Let's move to the next slide. Here we have a map of Italy at this time. And despite the declaration of the Kingdom of Italy in 1861, Italy was not yet fully united. And really one of the main obstacles was the Pope. In 1860, papal territory had been invaded by Piedmont, and the Pope lost 2/3 of the papal states, including important cities like Bologna. All that remained was Rome and the surrounding area. He had no desire to lose his kingdom because it had been handed down to him as a sacred trust and had been the patrimony of the popes for over 1,000 years. The Pope's temporal power, his rule over this kingdom, was seen as an essential guarantee of his spiritual authority and the independence of the church. In these uncertain times, when so many traditional values were under attack, the authority of the Pope began to be seen more and more as a guarantee of truth and order. And since no earthly power could be trusted, as recent history proved, it was considered essential that the Pope maintained his kingdom as much as possible, so that his spiritual authority remained intact. And as we will see, Catholics were even prepared to die for this. Now, already, especially in 1860, foreigners had volunteered to defend the Pope from his enemies, to defend their common father. And these included over 1,000 Irishmen who, in the summer of 1860, formed the Battalion of St. Patrick. And then the following year, 1861, a new military unit was formed, consisting mostly of foreign volunteers. And as you know, the largest number came from the Netherlands, at least eventually, followed by France and Belgium. And this regiment was the Pontifical or the Papal Zouaves. Let's go to the next slide. Now, if you're not connected to the Zouave Museum and you're not quite sure what a Zouave is, perhaps I should just briefly explain. Largely forgotten today, the Zouaves were very fashionable in 19th century armies. They were named after the fearsome mountain fighters of Algeria, and a regiment of Zouaves had become an elite part of the French army from the 1830s onwards. And their reputation quickly spread, and they became the ideal of the mid-19th century army. And any self-respecting army, especially in Europe and elsewhere as well, had a regiment of Zouaves. Let's go to the next slide. Zouaves were among the most decorated French troops during the period, and they were also widely imitated in the American Civil War, when there were many, many units. Little wonder that their glamour and their reputation reached papal Rome. And so a regiment was formed, although people were rather surprised that the new papal regiment had an Arab-sounding name and rather exotic uniforms with those baggy trousers, although it was argued that the uniform had great advantage given the climate and the terrain of central Italy. The first 6 years of the Zouaves' existence were relatively quiet. Despite the constant threat of invasion and revolution, much of the time was spent on guard or garrison duty, or fighting brigands in the Roman Campania. But things began to develop in 1867. The Pope had become especially vulnerable because the previous year, due to a diplomatic arrangement, the French troops that had been protecting the Pope since 1849 had returned home. Moreover, in 1866, Venezia, that whole region around Venice, had become part of the Kingdom of Italy. So the Papal States, as much as they existed, had become the only major part of the Italian peninsula which was not incorporated into the Kingdom of Italy. Let's move to the next slide. Giuseppe Garibaldi had long spoken of marching on Rome. He used to say, Roma or morte, Rome or death. And so in 1867, there was an attempt at a revolution in the city in the autumn. In fact, some supporters of Garibaldi blew up a barracks near St. Peter's, and 25 Zouaves were killed, as well as several citizens of Rome. And around the same time, the followers of Garibaldi, the red shirts, headed towards the Eternal City from various directions. And so the short campaign of 1867 was fought. And in many ways, it was the high point of the history of the Papal Zouaves. A number of small actions were fought, small battles in October against the red shirts at Monte Rotondo, Monte Libretti, Bagnoria, Viterbo, and elsewhere. And then finally, the Battle of Mentana on the 3rd of November, which you can see on the screen. Now, what's interesting for our story, which is really focused on the British Zouaves, is that among the casualties at the battle in this campaign of 1867 were 2 English Zouaves. They were among the first from this country to join the regiment. Both had brothers who were also in the Zouaves, and both belonged to families who had strong links to France, which is probably where they encountered the whole volunteer movement for the Pope. Let's go to the next slide. The first English Zouave to be killed was Alfred Collingridge, originally from the area around Oxford, and he had actually been a student in France before joining the Zouaves. He planned originally to become a priest, a Jesuit, and it's recorded that he hoped to go to heaven by the direct road of martyrdom, by dying on the battlefield as a soldier, as he had formerly wished to die as a priest, tending the sick. He was seriously wounded at the Battle of Monte Libretti and taken to a makeshift hospital in a chapel at nearby Nerola, where he died shortly afterwards. As he lay dying, he was visited by his brother George, who was also a Zouave, by the English Zouave chaplain, and by a remarkable lady called Mrs. Stone, who we'll be meeting again a bit later. And he prayed on his deathbed, "May God accept my death and my blood for the triumph of the Holy Church and for the conversion of England." Sentiments very similar to other Zouaves who died in the conflict. On hearing of his death, his father expressed his regret that he could not take his son's vacant place. His brother George, meanwhile, who would later move to Australia and become an important artist, wrote home that he is now a saint in heaven praying for us, and so our family must be happy. Let's move on to the next slide. So Alfred Collingridge was the first English Zouave to die. The second one, shortly afterwards, was Julian Watts Russell, whose monument I used to see when I was a student at the English College in Rome. He was known to many of his friends and family as Julio, and he was killed in the later stages of the Battle of Mentana by a bullet that went through his right eye. He was aged only 17 and 10 months, and he was presented in literature as the ideal saintly Zouave, a Zouave martyr. He was young, and he presented an image of innocence and purity. He belonged to a wealthy family from Staffordshire in the middle of England. His father, Michael, was educated at Eton and Oxford, so he was from a fairly good background, and his father had been ordained a priest in the Church of England. But in 1845, he became a Catholic, along with his wife and his children. And as a result, he was excluded from his father's will. By the time of Julian's birth in 1850, the family were living in Italy, in Florence. And their life was itinerant. It moved around, flitting between Kensington in London, Florence, Venice, Rome, and elsewhere. And they even considered starting a new life in Australia. They were also deeply religious. The mother of Julian, Maria, died in 1851, and on her deathbed apparently saw an angel who was eagerly waiting to conduct her into the presence of God. Michael, the father, was a friend of John Henry Newman, one of the most famous English Catholics of the period, who later became a cardinal. And Julian's father was eventually ordained a priest himself after his wife had died. And he spent his final years residing at the French shrine of Lourdes. Julian's own deep piety spread even into the military sphere, especially his holy custom of saying a Hail Mary every time he shot his gun, just in case he would kill or injure somebody, and that Hail Mary was for the person that he was potentially harming. A South American Zouave who was with Julian at Mentana described him as an angel of vengeance as he charged with his fixed bayonet, bareheaded, since a bullet had knocked off his cap. So this perhaps sums up the 19th century ideal of a Zouave, combining courage with deep piety and faith. He was killed at Mentana, and his body was brought back to Rome, where it was treated as if it was the body of a saint. People came to visit it and say prayers by his body, to kiss it, and even take away little relics like the relics of the evergreen plants that surrounded his body. His brother Wilfrid, who was also a Zouave, could not help saying that the funeral had left upon him the impression of a festival. It was not a sad occasion, rather a celebration. Let's move on to the next slide. So Alfred Collingridge and Julian Watts-Russell were a small part of this group of Zouave heroes and martyrs whose names and images were familiar to so many Catholics at the period. In fact, here is an image of all the Zouaves who were killed in the campaign of 1867. I think Julian Watts-Russell is right at the bottom, at the left-hand side, and Alfred Collingridge is somewhere in the centre. There had been a handful of British recruits up until 1867, but the example of Alfred Collingridge and Julian Watts-Russell led to a marked increase of enthusiasm. Let's go to the next screen. All in all, 124 Englishmen joined the Zouaves. Now, I know that's nothing compared to the number of Dutch Zouaves, but it's interesting. 24 Zouaves came from Scotland, and about 179 Zouaves came from Ireland, which of course was not yet an independent nation. A small number of Britons also joined other papal regiments like the Papal Dragoons and the Papal Artillery. And as we see from the slide, there was a great number of Zouaves joining in 1867 after Mentana, and then a lot in 1868. Their number then goes down a little bit until the crisis of September 1870, which we'll look at a bit later. Who were these Zouaves? Well, they came from very different backgrounds, and it'd be interesting to compare the British experience to the Dutch experience. There were some aristocratic Zouaves who came from long established Catholic families, like the Peters or the Vavasours or the Maxwells. If we move to the next slide, the Vavasours, who produced two Zouaves, they lived at Hazelwood Castle in Yorkshire, which you can see on the left-hand side, and the family had lived there since the 11th century. Some Zouaves had a military background and had already served in the British Army, but the majority were actually from the middle classes, which is perhaps not surprising given the expenses involved in travelling to Rome. Some, though, did have humbler origins, the sons of carpenters or millers. There was even one former inmate of Worcester Workhouse. You can see that on the right-hand side. A workhouse, I'm not sure whether you had them in the Netherlands, but they were institutions where those unable to support themselves financially were offered accommodation and employment. Probably some of those who went there would have seen them as something of a prison as well. So a vast range of social backgrounds, some from castles, some from workhouses, but most of them from the middle classes. And although most of them were in their late teens or 20s, most were young men, there were one or two who were more mature, like William Brennan of London, who joined at the age of 45, or Jacob Hind, one of the few Welsh Zouaves, who was 52. Let's move on to the next slide. Why did these British men join the papal army? Well, most seem to have been inspired by religious motivations, and I'm sure that's the same in the Netherlands. They wanted to fight for the Pope, who was seen as a living martyr. They wanted to fight against the threats, as they saw it, of revolution and liberalism and atheism and Freemasonry. That's certainly what we see in a lot of their letters and books and correspondence. Perhaps for some English volunteers, they were expressing gratitude for Pius IX's support for English Catholics. Remember, English Catholics were enjoying new freedoms, and some of them saw joining the papal army as making reparation, as they put it, making up for the sins of the Reformation. But mixed in with all of these religious motivations was a desire for travel and adventure and for the broadening of horizons. One English Zouave, Joseph Powell, later wrote a memoir entitled 2 Years in the Pontifical Zouaves. And the subtitle is very interesting. The subtitle is A Narrative of Travel, Residence and Experience in the Roman States. So as the subtitle suggests, it's not really primarily a military memoir. The military details are actually quite limited. Most of it is a travel book, places that he saw, sights seen, experiences he had, just like the Grand Tour of the 18th century, just like the pilgrims who went to Rome for many, many centuries. And how did they join? There were no recruiting offices in Britain, but prominent lay Catholics, including several titled aristocrats and members of parliament, and even a future Home Secretary, formed an organisation called the Papal Defence Committee, similar to committees formed in other countries. And this helped with the logistics and the expenses of travel to Rome and life as a Zouave. Collections were made in churches, including donations specifically for rifles for the Pope. Those of you who go to church will know all about second collections for various charities, but it's amazing to think that in the 1860s in Britain, collections were being made to buy rifles for the papal army. The parish of St. Peter and St. Paul in Ribchester, which is in Lancashire, the north of England, donated 3 breech loaders for His Holiness in November 1867, for example. Let's move on to the next slide. As well as lay Catholics, the clergy also had an important part to play. In the spring of 1869, Archbishop Manning, the Archbishop of Westminster, visited the Church of Saffron Hill in London and blessed Jeremiah Crowley, 20 years old, who was preparing to leave for Italy to join the Zouaves. And the Archbishop said, to be a soldier for the Pope was the next best thing to being a priest. So the clergy was saying this is a very wonderful way of being a Catholic and practicing your faith, to join the Zouaves. Archbishop's House in London was used sometimes as a correspondence address for those who were applying to join the army in Rome. And when the chaplain to the English Zouaves, Monsignor Stoner, visited London in September 1868, he invited potential applicants to meet him at the Archbishop's house. In the picture on the screen, you can see a priest from the north of England, the Newcastle area, Canon Thomas Wilkinson. He's sitting in the centre. He later became a bishop, and he managed to send 6 of his parishioners to Rome to join the Zouaves, and we see them in this picture. And in fact, he got a silver medal from the Pope as a result. But not all priests were as successful or indeed as enthusiastic to help the recruiting process. Of course, any man who wanted to join the Papal Zouaves needed a character reference from their parish priest to make sure that the right sort of people were joining. One of the questions I had when I was writing the book, and especially after meeting Arno and learning a bit about the Dutch experience, is why were there so few British Zouaves? In the Netherlands, we had over 3,000 joining the regiment. Why were there so few from Britain? Because after all, at least on paper, Britain and the Netherlands had a lot in common. Catholics were in a minority in both countries, although in some areas they predominated. The monarchy itself was at the heart of the Protestant establishment, both in the Netherlands and Britain. Catholics also had a long experience, a long history of persecution, of going underground, worshipping secretly, avoiding public profession of faith. Conditions, though, were improving, and identity strengthened. I've already mentioned the ways that English Catholics were experiencing more freedom in the 19th century. And indeed, in 1850, Pius IX restored the system of dioceses and bishops centered around Westminster. And of course, in the Netherlands, the bishops were restored in 1853, just 3 years later. So there seems to be a great deal of similarity between Britain and the Netherlands. But why were there so many Zouaves from the Netherlands, and why only 124 from England and a few from Scotland and Wales and Ireland? Let's move to the next slide. So here are just a few perhaps reasons why there were obstacles to British recruitment. Firstly, I think there was in many places limited enthusiasm. According to an English priest in the Vatican called Monsignor Talbot, the English character was naturally opposed to Roman authority. The English tend to love freedom, and they tend to be rather suspicious of Rome. Catholics, he said, had been corrupted by the Protestant atmosphere and displayed a narrow-minded spirit. And it's certainly true that not all clergy and not all bishops were as enthusiastic about joining the papal army as the likes of Archbishop Manning. They could be cautious and insular. They didn't want to rock the boat. They didn't want to endanger the freedoms that English Catholics had recently been given. And indeed, English Catholics were keen all the time to show that they could be faithful and loyal British subjects at the same time as being good Catholics. Joining a foreign army was also technically illegal due to the Foreign Enlistment Act of 1817. And I know in other countries, including the Netherlands, there were similar pieces of legislation. And although it was normally considered a dead letter, it wasn't really followed through, problems could be caused. In fact, when a group of Zouave volunteers from Scotland were waiting in London for their ship to France, they were scattered about the low coffee houses, scattered all across the area to evade anybody from the government trying to arrest them or stop them. There was a fear that the Foreign Enlistment Act would be pushed forward and activated. And of course, in the Netherlands, as you know, joining the Zouaves had great threats. You know, it could result in the loss of Dutch citizenship. Another obstacle to British recruitment was the critical attitude of many peers. Recruits are reported to have left their offices amidst the jeers of their colleagues, people making fun of them. Why are you going to Rome? Why are you joining the papal army? And indeed, once they were over in Rome, conditions were very difficult. There were linguistic difficulties. Many of them didn't speak Italian or even French. There were harsh conditions and poor pay, and even just the boredom of guard duty. There may also have been an element of xenophobia and superiority. The 19th century was a golden age for Britain. Britain ruled the waves. They were the most powerful navy. They had a growing empire. Why would a subject of Queen Victoria want to join a second-rate army in central Italy? It's also finally interesting to note that there was a fairly unenthusiastic response in Catholic Ireland, where you would expect there to be thousands of volunteers for the Zouaves. Only 179 joined the regiment. And this is largely because Ireland had their great enthusiasm in 1860, when, as I mentioned earlier, 1,300 Irishmen joined the Battalion of St. Patrick, which saw action at the battles of Castelfidardo and the sieges of Spoleto, Perugia, and Ancona. It fought very well and bravely, but there were lots of problems with leadership and organisation. Many complained about the conditions and the poor salary, and there were problems of language and communication, and even hostility from the local population. The men were hurriedly trained and issued with old uniforms and weapons, and there were some examples of unfortunate and violent behaviour. So in the light of all these problems in 1860, there was limited enthusiasm in Ireland in the late 1860s after the Battle of Mentana. They didn't really want to go through that experience all over again. Let's move to the next slide. So we've looked at the obstacles to recruitment in Britain, but we mustn't forget that there were 124 English Zouaves, 179 from Ireland, and many from Scotland too, which is something to celebrate on an evening like this. The British Zouaves certainly had an identity of their own, just like the other countries involved in the regiment. They had their own chaplain. Here we see a picture of Monsignor Stoner, who was from an aristocratic background, the son of Lord Camoys. There was a separate club for the English Zouaves near the Basilica of San Andrea della Valle, where they could relax and enjoy a good meal, play billiards, read the latest newspapers and journals, and even rent a room for the night. And because it's a very English sport, the English Zouaves organised cricket matches, very popular in the 1860s. In March 1868, there was a cricket match between all England in Rome and all English Zouaves near the Villa Borghese. And in fact, one of the Zouaves, Frederick Tristan Wellman, later went on to become a professional cricket player, and he played for Middlesex, Somerset, and Surrey. So English Zouaves had a way of celebrating and keeping their own identity. Let's move on. The next slide. Although, of course, only men could join the Zouaves, there were many enthusiastic women who supported them, and we mustn't forget them either, especially through their prayers, their correspondence, and their financial and charity support. In Dublin, an Irish Ladies' Papal Defence Fund was set up in 1868. They were told, "You cannot, with the chivalrous Zouaves, shed your blood in the cause of religion and God, but you can, by a little sacrifice, find means to supply that sustenance without which the most devoted cannot maintain the combat." So they sent money in for food and clothing and other necessities for the Zouaves. On the screen, you will see a picture of a nun, a Dominican nun called Mother Frances Raphael Drain. She was a great supporter of the Zouaves, and she wrote a song for the British Zouaves, which became their anthem, their hymn. Here are some lines from it. "We come from the blue shores of England, from the mountains of Scotia we come, from the green, faithful island of Erin, Ireland, far, far from our wild northern home. If 'tis sweet for our country to perish, sweeter far for the cause of today. Though the odds be against us, what matter? While God and Our Lady look down, and the saints of our country are near us, and angels are holding the crown." So poems and hymns and songs like this all helped form an identity of English Zouaves. Throughout Zouave literature, the mothers of Zouaves played a very important role, encouraging their sons to risk their lives for the holy cause, sometimes in the face of the father's opposition. And of course, the mothers had to make a great sacrifice in sending their sons to Rome. One well-born, wealthy mother of two English Zouaves, the Honourable Mrs. Canover, did much to encourage recruits, and she even tried her best to form a separate English battalion, which never happened. She also made two flags that were given to the British Zouaves during a ceremony in Rome in 1868. So once again, having your own flag, even though you don't have your own regiment, that really helped form a British Zouave identity. And there were those also who helped the troops in Rome, acting a bit like Florence Nightingale in the hospitals and on the battlefields, angels of mercy. And probably the greatest English example, and one that I know Arno is very enthusiastic about, is Mrs. Stone, Catherine Mary Stone. We have no picture of her, but we know that she belonged to an old and distinguished Catholic family based in Sussex, the south of England. Mrs. Stone was a writer and a poet in her own right. She wrote for the English Catholic journal, The Tablet, and she wrote a volume of poetry that you can see on the screen entitled Our Flag, which contains lots of poems to do with the Zouaves. She was very popular with the men, She won much admiration for the way she helped them, even in the danger of battle. The chaplain to the Zouaves, Monsignor Stoner, said he talked about the joy and consolation for those who were wounded and dying on the field, to have the tender cares of Mrs. Stone, who was faithful to them to the last, and whom he had himself seen on the battlefield, braving every danger, holding up the head of the dying, and whispering words of piety and encouragement to those in the agony of suffering. So the Zouaves, not just about the men, the soldiers, it's also about their families and their friends, those who supported them, and indeed some remarkable and very courageous women who were there at the battlefield in the front line, helping the cause. And I wonder whether there were any equivalent figures in the Dutch experience. Talking about the distinctive British Zouave identity, there were, of course, tensions between the different nationalities. And of course, the Irish Zouaves, as you might expect, were often fighting the English Zouaves, at least fighting in terms of words and arguments. They were proud of their own distinctive identity and always unhappy to be grouped together with the English. They were often rather suspicious of the English Zouaves, thinking that they were trying to control everything. And the English authorities were also suspicious of the Irish, thinking that they were basically revolutionaries and couldn't really be trusted. Let's move to the next picture. For those who are not so familiar with the story, and I know many of you will be, the final chapter of the short history of the Zouaves comes in 1870. The French troops, the French soldiers who had come to Rome around the time of Mentana, now had to go home because of the war between France and Germany. And the consequences for the Pope were truly momentous. Just like in 1867, the Pope was truly vulnerable and exposed. And the Kingdom of Italy made the most of the opportunity. They ostensibly sent 60,000 men to protect Rome from revolution at this time of uncertainty. But it was very clear that the King of Italy had his eyes on Rome as his new capital and wanted to complete the work of unification. The Pope, of course, refused permission for the Italian troops to enter his kingdom and enter the city of Rome, and volunteers rushed to Rome from all over Europe and beyond to help defend the Pope. Many Zouaves who had left the regiment and had done their service rejoined at this moment of crisis. To cut a long story short, the Italian soldiers surrounded the city of Rome, and on the 20th of September, they bombarded the city with their artillery. A hole was formed in part of the wall near the Porta Pia, and Italian soldiers began to advance through the walls of Rome into the papal city. And in the picture, which was taken shortly after the 20th of September 1870, you can see some of the defences and the damaged piece of the city wall near the Porta Pia, where the Italian troops advanced. Of course, highly symbolic that it was the Porta Pia that was the place where Rome was attacked, named after a previous pope called Pius, but of course the current pope called Pius was also under attack. Let's go to the final picture. After the fall of Rome, you might think it's the end of the story, but not quite. Of course, we can't really compare to the Dutch experience. There were no real veteran associations. Alas, there's no British Zouave Museum. There's no magnificent basilica like the one at Oldenbosch. But some former British Zouaves established an organization called the League of St. Sebastian, which was active in the 1870s and early 1880s. And it took up the Zouave cause through peaceful means, through articles and talks, and they organized masses, requiems for Zouaves who had died. They sent loyal addresses to the Eternal City and promoted collections for the Pope. There's very little information about this organization, but we do know that it existed through newspapers of the time. The former Zouaves, of course, entered all sorts of professions and careers. At least one English volunteer was ordained a priest, John Archdeacon, who became a priest in the area around Salisbury. Several former Zouaves wrote about their experiences. We've already mentioned Joseph Powell, who produced his memoir, but also there was an Irish Zouave called Bartle Teeling, who wrote a novel based on his experiences called My First Prisoner, and another English Zouave called Wilfred Clavering Robinson wrote a novel entitled Under the Cross Keys. So Zouaves were writing about their experiences right until the 20th century. When I was writing my book, I tried to track down some of the families of those people who joined the Zouaves, and it proved to be very, very difficult, not helped, of course, by the lockdown. Sadly, there's very little mention of the Zouaves in the archives in England. I'm in charge of the Westminster Diocesan Archive, which is one of the biggest collections of Catholic documents in England. There's hardly anything about the Zouaves there. I guess that's partly because the bishops were not directly involved all the time in Zouave recruitment and tried to be very discreet in their dealings. I'm sure there were some useful documents I didn't find, but periodicals and newspapers were full of illuminating reports. Thank God for digitalization of all these amazing newspapers. And thanks to various genealogical websites, I managed to find some of the descendants of the British Zouaves, including the Collingridge family. I mentioned Alfred Collingridge earlier on, and I tracked down their descendants in Australia, and they were very, very kind in sending me some photos and other memories of the Zouaves. I'm sure in attics and cupboards around the country there are boxes with newspapers and diaries and photos which are waiting to be discovered, but it is sometimes very challenging to get archival material about this fascinating subject. We might think of the pontifical Zouaves as heroic failures. They fought only a handful of battles. In fact, only about 1% of Zouaves actually died as a result of battle. The British recruits showed a desire, nevertheless, to contribute to the ongoing struggles that were widely being reported in the newspapers and discussed at public meetings. So the fact that people were joining the Zouaves shows an engagement with politics and religion in the 19th century, something that wouldn't have been so possible 100 years before, and something made possible really by newspapers, by the growing media and the growing means of communication and transport. But the importance of the Zouaves did not lie really in military glory. Their importance really lay in their visible expression of international Catholicism. What counted was not the shots they fired, but the newspaper articles they inspired, the signatures they gathered, the money they raised for the Pope. And even more importantly for them was the witness to the faith that they provided, showing that the British and the Irish could stand alongside their continental neighbours in defending the Pope and defending the centre of Christendom. It was another sign that Catholics from this country had truly come of age and were enjoying new freedom. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, Nick, I want to thank you very much for this interesting talk about the Zouaves, and I hope that everybody enjoyed it. I see we've had at least international attention from Italy as well, and from the Netherlands, of course. Must have been also from the UK. So I'm very, very happy with your talk and with how our first ever online meeting has gone. If there are any questions, please feel free to send an email. We'll get back to you with the answers. We'll contact Nick if necessary. Of course, if you're also interested in his book, We've got a few copies in the museum on sale. So also please send us an email. The emails are here, but we'll also put them in the description of the video, so it's easier. Also, I want everybody to know that you can follow us on social media: Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. We can be seen on different platforms. And let me just switch back. Voila. So thank you very much, everybody, for watching. Please do buy the book, visit our museum, and follow us on the social media. And I hope there will be more talks like these to come in the future. Nick, do you have any last words for our viewers?
Just thank you all for tuning in, and a great honor to be part of your anniversary and for this inaugural online talk. And it'd be great, wouldn't it, if we could get more people from different countries where there were Zouaves to kind of contribute to the knowledge and our understanding, and to compare the different countries and the whole Zouave movement.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let's try to make that happen. Well, everybody, thank you for viewing and have a lovely evening. And Nick, thank you for the talk. And until next time.
Good night.
Good night.